Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. In today's episode of Dungeons & Dragons Horror Stories, we have a tale of a player that makes his character antisocial and often go off on his own. The DM then has a creative way to involve the other players, but that isn't good enough for this player. Then we have a story of a DM that takes a character's physical description to unfair degrees. And finally, a story of a player that has a bad experience with a DM with illogical rulings, and a player that's pretty obnoxious. But first, here he is. It's Lucky to help farm them likes. He is catting the best way that he can cat. Now let's move on to the stories. Player at table gets easily agitated when things don't go his way exactly the way he wants. By Reddit user Cupcake Pantry. So, I'm in a group with some friends playing a weekly game, and we all love it and our characters. But sometimes one of our players, we'll call him Dustin, gets bent out of shape really easily, and last week was a total fun suck for me. So Dustin has a character that generally likes to lone wolf it, despite being a part of the group. One of the other characters is his backstory established wife, so it's not as if he has no connection to what we're doing as the overarching plot of the game. It's hard in character to get them to talk with the other PCs, or even let them help him when he's out doing dangerous stuff. That by itself, totally fine, and I like the character work from that dynamic. But last week, things got especially bad. So he, for reasons I will not get into, wanted to murder an NPC that was a threat to another NPC. Okay, cool, totally fine. The murder victim in question is a person in a position of power, and an evil one at that, with a live-in bodyguard to boot. While his wife would have problems with him doing this, though both wife's player and myself were excited to see what would happen, this isn't the first time Dustin has had a run-in with this NPC either. Dustin has a tendency to take up whole sessions when he goes off on his own too. Again, that doesn't really bother me. Shit gets crazy and it's always fun to listen to. Our DM, in the previous encounter with this NPC, gave me and the wife player the character sheets for the NPC and his bodyguard, so we would have something to do and not just be sitting there hanging out. So we were handed them again for this encounter. Now, I'm not attached to this NPC at all. They're a side character, and frankly, don't have any impact on anyone's story but Dustin's. But I wanted to play him realistically, as if I were invested in their survival, and not just a vehicle for Dustin to get to be cool. So, the scene. Dustin breaks into this NPC's house from the bedroom window and prepares to knife them. I ask the DM privately if my character would have any traps or defenses set up. He asks me if I have any spells on his sheet that would let me do that. I don't. The wife, now a bodyguard player, in the private chat, tells me they have alarm and that they can cast it as many times as they want. Great, the DM says, and allows the bodyguard player to figure out a good way to alarm this room. It's a hexagonal room with windows on each face and a staircase at the opposite wall of the bed. Bodyguard alarms the space on either side of the bed and the staircase landing. Dustin, not knowing the exact areas where the alarm spell has been cast, but knowing the spell was used through context clues, starts hopping on furniture, floor is lava style, to get to the bed. I'm rolling my eyes a little at this point, cause he's never done such a thing before when breaking into someone's home, but okay, I'll give him the mulligan. He gets on the bed, not knowing the alarm spell contains the portion of the bed he's standing on, and alarm goes off. The NPC I'm playing wakes up and dimension doors down to his bodyguard's bedroom to wake him, telling him there's a man in his chambers. At this point, Dustin gets huffy and says, quote, "I mean, I don't know how they knew I was coming, but okay." I shrug and say, quote, "You're not the only person they could be scared is going to assassinate them," which makes plenty of sense for this NPC. The point is dropped, and we move on. The fight ensues, and it eventually comes to pass that the bodyguard starts begging the NPC to flee. I don't do that, and instead stay and fight with a sliver of my health. I get knocked out. The bodyguard picks the NPC up in his arms and tries to run. Dustin continues to attack the NPC's near lifeless body, and I fail all of the death saves. With NPC dead, bodyguard attacks Dustin and knocks him out in 2 final hits. Bodyguard ties Dustin up and removes his weapons, takes NPC's body into the streets, and begins begging for a cleric. The DM says there isn't a cleric in range that is high enough level to help. Dustin is agitated at this point, and asks if there's anyone that can help him. The DM says there are servants in the house, but he doesn't know if they'd help. Dustin seems bewildered by this, like they're supposed to revive an assassin in their employer's home. I don't know. The DM rolls on a percentage die to let it be up to fate instead. Nope, no one is willing to help, but they are watching. Dustin makes his death saves and complains the whole time. He succeeds and rolls a natural 20, upping himself to 1 hit point in consciousness. He asks to get out of the bonds he's been tied in, and says that, quote, "I've got thieves' tools and daggers all over me." The bodyguard player reminds DM that they disarmed Dustin before leaving. Dustin dramatically asks, quote, "What, you searched my entire body before trying to find someone to cast Revivify?" And I start to get a sour taste in my mouth. The DM hops in and says that his hands are restrained, so he'd have to do this without weapons regardless. Dustin makes his saves and rolls to untie himself without issue and flees the scene. The escape is hand-waved, and Dustin goes to lick his wounds and complains that the DM made it so unfair and was just trying to make it harder to do and just generally being rude and a brat. I am immediately uninterested in playing anymore. I shut down and stop engaging because I'm so angry with Dustin's shitty attitude and monopolization of the night. The rest of the session is spent on Dustin as well. There's a whole scene with him and the NPC he was defending, with the murder of their rival. The NPC is pissed because they'll be implicated, if not at least a suspect, and tells Dustin to leave town and never come back. I didn't really care to pay attention beyond the end of the night, where he fled town, alone, while my character and his wife are sitting in their inn rooms none the wiser. He leaves a note with his mother, and that's it. He claims it's safer this way. All in all, I couldn't care less that he did it. What I'm upset about is how he decided to react at the slightest obstacle. With the level Dustin was at, compared to the NPC, there was no real contest for him. The DM was trying to make it engaging for us all, and give it some actual stakes by letting the other 2 at the table be a part of it in some small way. Dustin metagamed and showed his ass the entire time, and had absolutely no consideration for anything but his own character and how cool he was or wasn't. I was at the point where I just said goodnight at the end of the game, and logged off instead of talking about the game for hours like we normally do at the end of the night. I intend to keep playing, and I still consider him to be one of my best friends, but that whole shitty attitude about it just rubbed me the absolute wrong way. I really hope this doesn't continue to linger in my mind while we play, but if he keeps this up, I don't know, man. It's absolutely acceptable for a character to go off on his own and do something that they don't want the other characters to know about, and roleplay it. And I think the way this DM took care of that, in letting the other players control the NPCs, is a nice way to keep everyone engaged with the game. Hell, my DM has done this before, where she let us control elementals during a test for a cleric. For Dustin to act like a brat when things didn't go his way or metagame is kinda shitty, not only to the other players, but to the DM as well. He should expect the other players to play those NPCs in character, and everything they did as those characters made sense. Hopefully, OP says something to the DM, and they can all as a group bring up the way Dustin acted and made everyone else feel, and come to some sort of conclusion. Granted, if Dustin can handle the criticism. Let's move on. DM nerfs my character to hell and back for a 1 sentence of inconsequential flavor text. By Reddit user, that Freddy is a Jack. About 1.5 years ago, I played a game of D&D 5e over Discord with a couple people I barely knew that got introduced to me from a mutual friend. Back then, I didn't know many people who were into D&D, so even though I didn't know them very well, I was excited to get back into the game. We were a total of 4 players and 1 DM, but since this is a story between the DM and me, and the other players have in my experience been nothing but welcoming, I'm going to leave them out of it. The campaign itself was homebrew. Our party was tossed between the front lines of a war and had to survive. I wouldn't call it grimdark, but the DM placed a lot of importance of all of our actions having far-reaching consequences, which sounded amazing to me at the time because I was largely used to very whimsical, more silly adventures. I joined the party a few sessions late, so as my character joins up with them, the DM asked me to visually describe my character, a furbolg barbarian named Pilgrim, in a few sentences. I say something along the lines of, he's a large, fat furbolg wearing a travel coat that seems to consist of more stitches and hasty fixes than actual fabric. And that should have been that. But little did I know, the DM would hold this one sentence over my head for the rest of my time with the group. So a short time later, the party and I come across a group of gnolls scavenging the remains of a battle from the day before. Since we were level 2, and 2 of our players had amassed some levels of exhaustion, we decided it was best to sneak past and make it to safety and have a rest. So, of course, the DM asked us to roll for stealth, addressing me specifically and telling me to roll with disadvantage. My brain was operating on autopilot for the moment, so I just did it, failing miserably in drawing the gnolls' attention towards the party. At the time, I didn't feel too bad about it, because I wasn't the only one who failed the check. But a few minutes later, my brain caught up with the action, and I made a mental note to ask the DM why he gave me disadvantage after the session, since by that time, we had gained the upper hand in combat due to some lucky rolls, and I didn't want to ruin the momentum. So I texted the DM after the session in private, asking why he gave me disadvantage on the roll, and here's what I get back. I thought it would be realistic to give your character disadvantage on dexterity-based checks, since you insisted on making him fat. So, ignoring that, in the fiction of the game, if a gnome is able to shove a grown orc to the ground if they have a lucky roll, a fat character should be able to move without shaking the ground and alerting every creature in the vicinity. Strong people, especially in the olden days, would be fat. To get abs, you need to have an incredibly specific workout plan, diet, and in extreme cases, a lot of dehydration. It's not like I even insisted for Pilgrim to be a sneaky rogue or acrobatic monk. He was a barbarian. He swung around a big axe. Of course he has mass. So I texted the DM back, telling him I was worried that this would give my character an unfair disadvantage. But he assuaged me, saying he would give every character strengths and weaknesses befitting their character. To quote John Mulaney, and then he didn't. That gnome shoving down an orc thing happened. A character who was raised as a slave to forge weapons for the military, could read and write in 3 languages, and my fat goddamn barbarian got a disadvantage on every dexterity-based check. The DM was also really mean-spirited in the way he flavored every action my character took. If he fell, his body jiggled. If sat down, he plomped down. If he ran, he coughed and panted and dry-heaved. If he interacted with any female NPC, the DM took care to mention that they looked much more interested in talking to my party members. If you're waiting for the DM to get his comeuppance, I'm afraid I have to disappoint you. I quit after 2 more sessions, and 1 more try to reason with the DM, in which he offered me to just retcon Pilgrim's fatness. But you know what? Fuck no. This was no longer fun, and no D&D is always better than bad D&D. I can understand modifying the rules of D&D a little bit to throw a bit more realism into a game, though it sounded like this DM just had it out for OP's character for being fat. To give a character disadvantage on all dex rolls just for their appearance is kinda messed up, and to then not do the same for the other players suggests to me that maybe this DM just didn't like the concept of people being a little overweight. Sure, the DM offered to do away with the disadvantage on dex and retcon the character's appearance, but at that point, the damage was already done. Good on OP for leaving and adhering to the old adage, no D&D is better than bad D&D. Though, I am curious what you would have done if you were in OP's shoes. Let's move on to the last story. Player makes others quit by being toxic. By Reddit user, Oathkeeper Druid. Our game started its first session last week. It was nothing short of a disaster for various different reasons. During the game, one of the players, let's call him Numbnuts, immediately gave off a bad impression by repeatedly cutting off people mid-sentence and correcting them whenever they spoke out. Whenever I would ask the DM questions about the scene, he would immediately interrupt her and make rulings on her behalf, acting as a know-it-all. Me. Can I spot a leader in the group of goblins? Any markings that would identify him as the leader of the group? DM. Well, you can. Numbnuts cuts him off. Goblins don't have leaders. Leaders don't fight with the other goblins. During another situation. Me. I'd like to hog tie the goblin. My character specializes as being a hunter and is proficient in survival. He goes on a 15-minute rant about how I shouldn't tie the goblin down that way and how his way of tying is better, and he should be tied against a tree. His character had a -2 to survival skills. It became increasingly difficult to roleplay or act out our fight scenes. During the goblin fight, Numbnuts decided to attack another player mid-combat for absolutely no reason. This obviously pissed off the group. After enduring him for 3 hours, another player attempts to kill him by pushing him into a trap. He survives. An audible sigh could be heard from the other players. We end the session and one of the other players quits on the spot. I had a chat with him and he explained to me that he was quitting because of that player. He told me he had played with Numbnuts before and he would do the same things in other groups. The only reason he lasted as long as he did in his previous group is because one of the girls knows how to control him and screams at him to shut the fuck up every time he acts out. I told him that I was debating quitting because of that player as well. Him and I talked to the DM about the problem player and told her that the entire group would fall apart with him in it, and she asked us to give him another chance. I reluctantly agreed, despite knowing that kind of behavior is not done on purpose. It's not something he can change. Today was our second session. Our group explored a cave, and one of the players snuck away and warned the boss we were there. Almost instantly, without giving us a chance to react or move, we were blocked off into a cave by that leader and its entire army. 16 mobs. DM. The goblin runs into the room and shoots his arrow. It is 16 to hit. I am at the front of the cave with a 17 armor class. Who has an armor class less than 16? Player all the way at the back. Me? Me. DM, I'm actually right in front of the goblin. Keep in mind, this is Roll20 where we can see where the tokens are placed on the battlefield. Also keep in mind that until this session, goblins had tokens of pictures of Link from the Legend of Zelda games. DM. Okay, player at the back. The arrow will hit you for 9 damage. This knocks out the player. With our group in an imminent TPK situation, I tried to think outside the box. 2 turns into combat, I turned invisible with my racial furball trait, ran to the outside of the cave for a better angle, and used my slingshot to collapse a stalactite on top of the boss. I informed everyone that my hidden step ability was no longer active, and that I was no longer invisible. I rolled a natural 20 on my slingshot, expecting to have this amazing moment where I saved the day from an overwhelming goblin army, and crushed the bugbear leader, 5d6 fall damage plus 1d8 damage, and he had already taken about 10 damage. This is level 1 by the way. There was no dex save for the boss for the stalactite because he was under the laughing spell. I prepared to roleplay his death, but the DM ignores my attack and moves on with combat. I am immediately confused. I ask, what happened to the leader? Isn't he dead? She replies with, quote, I just gave him the slingshot damage. Me. Oh, okay. I informed the group that I was hiding in the bushes, as shown on the Roll20 map. On that turn, 2 players get knocked down. The fairy runs away from the fight and is now 100 feet away. The fairy then rolls an attack from 100 feet away into a dark cave, which she doesn't have dark vision range, and somehow hits the boss who is behind the corner of a wall, no line of sight, and kills him. Had she not killed the boss, the other 3 players would have been dead. Great, at least they're saved I guess. The goblins scatter and the DM allows the players to leave the cave. I receive a PM. Numbnuts. You're no longer invisible, you know that. Me. I know that. I told everyone my hidden step ended once I attacked 3 turns ago. Numbnuts. You're not invisible, okay? Me. I already know that. But honestly, the fight should have ended 3 turns ago when the boss got hit by the stalactite. Numbnuts. Actually, she gave him the slingshot damage. Me. I never shot the boss with a slingshot. I collapsed a stalactite 60 feet above his head. Numbnuts. That's not up to you. And besides, you know this is a team game, right? It's not all about you. Stop trying to steal the spotlight. Me. When did I ever say it's all about me? So, I spoke out in Discord and told everyone I was quitting because Numbnuts was sending me toxic DMs in the game. He replies, "No, I wasn't." So I told him that several other players felt the exact same about him and that the game won't survive with him in it. I then left the game and the Discord. Firstly, Numbnuts sounds like a complete asshat. Saying that goblins don't have leaders is plain out wrong. But besides that, it's rude to interrupt a DM like that, even if your monster lore is correct. Perhaps they are homebrewing something, and interrupting stops the game for everyone. Though, the DM isn't without blame here either. The whole rolling to hit and then picking the target afterwards is kind of bull. But then to pick a character that isn't even in the line of sight is the icing on top of that shit cake. Though, with that said, OP wanting to shoot the stalactite to cause it to drop on top of an enemy is totally up to the DM's discretion on whether that would happen or not, and OP shouldn't expect that to happen out of the gate. Though, if I was the DM, I would have let it happen, due to the rule of cool. Though, what are your thoughts? Do you have a story that you would like to be read in a video? If so, feel free to comment it below, post it in the channel subreddit, or even just at me on Twitter. As always, I appreciate all of you, and hope all of your rolls are natural 20s. Until next time.